Hello and welcome to this Info Corona special, where we are joined today by a very special guest. He's Professor of Political Science at Ashoka University, a columnist and former president of the Center for Policy Research, and one of the country's leading public intellectuals. Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta is our guest today on Info Corona. I appreciate your joining us, Professor Mehta. The big question that I want to start with is what for many has been a defining image of the last month. Lakhs of people walking back to their homes from the cities to the villages, thousands of kilometers by foot, desperate to get home because of a lockdown. What do these images, Professor Mehta, tell you about society today? What is it? What is the reality, in a sense, that's staring us in the face now?
Rajdeep, you're right. That is the defining image of this pandemic. And what these images have done is they have, in a sense, exposed, you might say, the innards, the inner skeleton of our society around three axes. One, they have revealed how easily we can strip millions and millions of people of their dignity and livelihood and literally not care. I mean, I can understand the hesitations in the first week. We weren't quite sure what we were doing, but 50 days into the lockdown, we still do not have a plan for them. We still have not given them adequate support. The discourse we built around them, right? The government's position, oh, but we are distributing some food. Oh, but they're getting 2 or 3 meals a day. Imagine what it is like, right? I mean, 50% of Indian households cannot survive if they do not get income support beyond a week or something of wages. To subject them to the indignity of being dependent, right, on civil society, to stand for hours in line for food, right? The sheer indignity and humiliation of it is something we are still not getting, right? We're just treating them as this army of surplus labor. Our only job is to make sure that they get the barest minimum to survive. It also tells you, frankly, something actually about society. The fact that all of us, academics included, media, elites, we, in a sense, conspired to, in a sense, make them invisible, right? The full impact of the kind of inequality, poverty, vulnerability that these images have exposed to us is still something that is not registering in our consciousness. This should be our priority number one. This should be outraging us. This should be inciting our collective action. This is something we need to go into mission mode on, right? But all we have, I'm afraid, after 50 days is still a kind of half regretful lament, almost as if we are embarrassed rather than outraged by what we have subjected our citizens to.
The irony, of course, Professor Mehta, is that these are the very people who built our cities in a way. They built our skyscrapers, built our highways, built our swimming pools, our penthouses. And as you said, they've suddenly got a face and they've been invisibilized. You wrote an interesting column where you seem to suggest that the migrant labor, or should I say the citizens of India, don't really need our pity. They don't need compassion as much as they need justice. What were you trying to suggest?
Well, it's very simple, Rajdeep, right? Our entire approach to helping them right now, first of all, it has been very dependent on civil society, right? A large part of even the slack of, providing food and so forth has been voluntary organizations, right? Now, that's fine in the case of an emergency. It's good that some civil society leaders have come forward. But just think of this, right? If any of us had to be dependent on somebody else's charity, what would that do to our sense of self? And particularly, these are people who work hard, right? They have never begged in their lives, right? You have, in a sense, converted them from working people to humiliated supplicants of all of us, right? What we need to be giving them, right? Not just grain, but I think much more generous cash transfers to provide them some income security, some sense, right, of that their future is not that precarious. That is not something we need to do as an afterthought, as an act of charity or even as an act of political prudence, they're going to be embarrassment. This is actually their right. None of us are having our income stopped because of this lockdown. Why should they only bear the costs of this lockdown, right? So I think the discourse needs to move, from one of sentiment and solidarity to an institutional articulation that they have claims, they have rights, and we need to ask the ethical question, what is the right framework of justice under which we should approach their plight?
It's fascinating what you're saying, because the narrative, Professor Mehta, since 1991, since liberalization, has been about an aspirational India. This is an India on the move. The urban middle class has been the focus of most narratives. Suddenly it appears that the urban poor are registering, at least in our consciousness. Do you believe that they were forgotten for way too long? And importantly, what does that say about the role of the state? Because the welfare state itself, post 1991, was seen to be in retreat. The focus was on markets economies. The markets will solve all inequities. Do you believe that there is a greater case now for welfarism, for a welfare state that reaches out to the urban poor, gives them the social security net that you speak about?
Rajdeep, there has been no society in the world, and I say literally no society in the world, that has flourished without a strong and robust welfare state, right? Whether it's China, whether it's the Koreas, you name it, right? First of all, you're right that in 1991, our discourse became, we were obsessed with just one question. Where do we need to get the state out of people's lives? It was a fair question, given that we had so many controls, interdiction, corruption, license permit raj. We forgot to ask one basic question. Where do we need to get the state into people's lives, right? The first catastrophic failure, as we are witnessing in this crisis, was actually around health and education, right? We absolutely did not invest enough in our own citizens, right? In public health, in education, which is the cornerstone of any robust economy. And I think in India, this discourse that the welfare state is somehow an obstacle to productivity, an obstacle to growth, that's got things backwards, right? Unless you have a healthy, independent, educated population, you're not going to be able to sustain growth either, right? So that, in a sense, was the first mistake. The second thing, I don't think it's quite true that we had done away with the welfare state. And I think one of the ironies of this moment is that the only instrument we are using in any form is the much maligned NREGA. I think John Drez should be given a Bharat Ratna and a Nobel Prize, right? This was the one single idea which we reviled, right? Saying this is making labor dependent just because it was, increasing labor's bargaining power, right? It's the only instrument we've had to starve of mass starvation and catastrophe in India. It's the only instrument we've had to give labor a little bit of bargaining power, right? Banks can go bust, companies can go bust, default. And by virtue of the default, they have bargaining power with the system, right? We evergreen, we bail them out. Giving labor a little bit of bargaining power, so there is a little bit of floor under them, that suddenly becomes welfarism and dependence. No, that's not welfarism and dependence. The point about welfare is that it makes our citizens and labor independent. It makes them independent because they're not then reliant on somebody's charity. They're not reliant in some ways on, trying to improvise and scrounge for basic necessities. So welfare states are an essential part of productivity. They're an essential part of freedom. And unless we link the three together, right, we are going to make the same mistakes that we did in 1991.
Ironically, though, Professor Mehta, at this very moment of acute labor distress, we have governments that are going, or some state governments that have decided to push ahead with labor reform, which allow managements greater flexibility in terms of hire and fire. Now, many economists are welcoming it, industry is welcoming it, but you in a recent column called it a travesty. I just want to understand, why do you believe that labor reform is a travesty?
So Rajdeep, two things. I think everybody agrees that our current system of labor laws was neither very good for labor nor was it good for capital. I mean, we are the only country in the world which has managed to, in a sense, mess up both. Right? So labor laws needed reforms. There's no dispute. The question is what constitutes reform, right? Now, there are draft proposals in Parliament. There's a bill which has some sensible suggestions on how uh, create flexibility in hiring and firing, how you bring contract labor under the ambit of labor law, right? How you reduce unnecessary inspections. I think those kinds of things, absolutely nobody disagrees, should be on the table, right? But look at what is happening in states like you, right? We are introducing 12-hour working days. Okay? This is barbarism of the 19th century, right? The UP ordinance apparently simply says all labor law stands suspended. You don't want workplace safety in a country like India, right? Workplace safety is related to health. It's related to morbidity. It's related to dignity. In fact, if anything, those are areas where we need to strengthen regulation. I mean, just visit any construction site and ask yourself the question, right? What protection does Indian labor have under hazardous chemicals? Right? So what we are doing in repealing these existing provisions, right, is we are actually doing away with what should be at the core of a sensible labor law, which is what are the core interests of labor that need to be protected, that are central to their dignity, that are central to their life, that are central to their health, right? And give them enough security so that they become stakeholders in the system. What we have instead done, and I'm amazed, right, given the fact that the central government's own legislation in Parliament is actually not a bad beginning. I mean, it at least provides a framework to discuss these things. Instead, you're just allowing the state governments to say, from henceforth, virtually no labor laws shall apply. Right? Let's come to bargaining power. It is true that most of our imaginations are colored by the 1970s and labor unions somehow being this obstacle to growth. But look at the facts on the ground, right? Since 1991, in terms of strikes and lockdowns, labor's power has diminished. Labor's share of gross domestic product and profits has decreased, right? Labor laws do not seem to have come in the way of higher turnover in companies that hire 100 plus workers, as Aditya Bhattacharya papers demonstrates. Right? So I think this myth somehow, right, that these labor laws, of course, these labor laws led to rent seeking. As I said, they need to be reformed. But the reform has to meet two objectives. It has to give employers the right kind of flexibility and incentives to invest in the human capital of their workforce. But it also has to give basic protections to workers. I mean, seriously, 12-hour working days in the 21st century there's no other word of describing it but barbarism.
Which brings me to a critical question, Professor Mehta, which is that in the age of a lockdown, are we seeing an increasingly coercive state? And the nature of the citizen-state engagement changes, where the citizen is so dependent on the state that he or she accepts whatever the state does, whether it is sort of restricting our personal freedoms during a lockdown, whether it's now extended to even RWAs who say we will cut your power, we will cut your water if you bring in unwanted guests. I'm just wondering whether a creeping authoritarianism and a coercive state is part of the lockdown sort of playbook.
So Rajdeep, you're right. Look, one of the things the lockdown has done, it has exacerbated a tendency that had already begun to rise, right? Just think of your profession, right? You have UAPA being applied against journalists, right? In different states. You have people, intellectuals, Anand Tendulkar, Sudha Bharadwaj being detained, right? So there was, in a sense, this slippage towards an authoritarian state. And frankly, almost all the checks and balances that we used to count on, the Supreme Court of India particularly, but also federal checks and balances were already weakening before this crisis. With this crisis, in some senses, what we have said effectively is let us give our entire constitution a toss. Right? Let's do something like labor reform entirely through ordinances. This is something on the concurrent list. You know, state governments can just pass an ordinance tomorrow. The president will give his concurrence, invalidate, right, what Parliament has enacted, and it's going to set a very dangerous precedent for federalism. We are in a situation where you obviously cannot organize protests and stuff, and therefore that is taken as a kind of acquiescence. The legal framework governing the rules that have been enacted under the pandemic. Quarantine rules were necessary. Parts of the lockdown are, of course, necessary. But what is the legal framework actually governing that? What is the mechanism that is going to ensure accountability that this framework is proportionate to actually what is required? We are all going to be made to download the Arogya Setu. Again, perhaps a useful technology, but is there the appropriate legal and legislative framework which can hold the government accountable? So we are moving to a situation where it's entirely a one-way street. The state wants to say, we will make citizens completely transparent to us. Right? We will collect all information. We can pass any rules interdicting what you do. At the same time, the state's accountability to the citizen is actually diminishing. Parliament has become non-functional. State legislative assemblies are non-functional. Executive discretion is rampant. The Supreme Court has more or less abdicated any accountability function. So the balance between the individual and state is now so much in the favor of the state that, frankly, I can't now go into a classroom and tell my students that I know what the Indian Constitution is. There isn't any such thing at the moment.
But governments across the world, and not just in India, say extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And therefore, the corona pandemic is an extraordinary once-in-a-century situation, and therefore that calls for an extraordinary measures. So concepts of federalism, concepts of democratic freedoms must necessarily be suspended, possibly, because we are in very, very difficult times.
Understood, Rajiv. This is a genuine emergency, and all systems allow for executives to exercise emergency powers. But again, I think it's important to make sure that we don't push ourselves into a false binary. Yes, the executive can exercise discretion, but it will exercise discretion much more effectively if it actually does it through a consultative process. Can't the chief ministers come together with the center, government and opposition together? It takes half a Zoom call to do it, right? To say, look, we are in a national emergency. Let's all come together, right? To draft something that actually takes into account all the stakeholders in some ways. Right? So I would argue actually that for the sustainability of many of these measures, it is important that these measures have widespread legitimacy. And they will not have widespread legitimacy if you do not have even basic consultative mechanisms in place. I understand, this is an unprecedented situation. All countries in the world are passing restrictions whose legal framework can be contested. But even if you want to exercise discretion, you can actually do it in a way and communicate it in a way where that discretion looks proportional, in a sense, to the issue at hand. And by the way, just on this another matter, if this is such a national emergency, which it is, why is the state expending so much energy and resources strengthening its powers in areas that are not necessary to addressing this emergency? It's not stopping the state from enacting UAPA against journalists. It's not stopping the state from arresting all kinds of people for expressing their opinion. It's not stopping the state from putting pressure on media, right? So I think it's a false binary. In fact, it's even more important when you're exercising discretionary power, right? To make sure that it is done in a way that inspires confidence, right? That we are doing it for the right intent, we don't intend to normalize this.
In a sense, are you saying, therefore, Professor Mehta, that coronavirus and its fallouts have also shown the limits of the politics of a political strongman? Because across the world, this is seen to be the era of the political strongman, whether it's a Trump in America, whether it's Mr. Modi in India, the muscular leader. Do you believe that coronavirus has shown the limits of that and the need perhaps for even these leaders to engage with a wider group through a more consultative process?
Absolutely, Rajdeep. I mean, look, modern societies are complex things. And in some senses, the pandemic has shined a nice X-ray onto how complex things are, right? I mean, you have to think supply chains, public health, economy, all of it together. Right? The idea that some kind of omnipotent leader who you think is irreplaceable would mobilize the kind of collective knowledge to be able to act in this kind of crisis is in some senses laughable. The societies that will come out of this crisis well are the societies that will have nurtured habits of solidarity, cooperation, and checks and balances. Not, in a sense, the societies that have relied on arbitrary discretionary power. I mean, the United States is a perfectly good example, right? Here's a country where we used to think, right, there are strong institutions, right? But the wreckage that President Trump unleashed on those institutions, right? The contempt for expertise within the executive order, the contempt for federalism, right? In some ways, the complete ignorance of constitutional niceties. It has now come back to haunt America. So most societies are actually built on the strength of their quotidian habits of cooperation. They are not built, right, if we wait for messiahs to come and save us. And I think that's what this crisis has exposed.
We've got a few more minutes. Let me ask a couple of more, go to a couple of more defining images. One was the demonization of minority groups that took place in the aftermath of the Tablighi incident. What does that again say about us when an entire community is almost demonized as corona carriers?
So Rajdeep, I mean, just think of how morally appalling this situation is, right? First of all, communalism has been on the ascendant in India over the last few years. And in a sense, this pandemic has accelerated. You have a national emergency. And the top priority of the government's political and propaganda machine, right, is to demonize a community. And to unfairly demonize a community. What the Tabligh did was extraordinarily stupid. Right? But the fact of the matter is, it was easy to construct a narrative because those were the only people you were testing. Right? As it now turning out, there are lots of different clusters that have been created by different kinds of religious gatherings. In Punjab, for example, right? Take Nanded, for example. So the fact that our headlines in the first 10, 15 days of the crisis are for 2 or 3 days dominated by this idea, right? Which was trying to subliminally suggest that in some senses the minorities are the alien element in the society. Really tells you something about the depths to, in a sense, which we have sunk. And frankly, I mean, let's be honest about this, Rajiv. The pushback against that did not come from us academics. It did not come from media. It actually came only finally when that kind of imagery became an international embarrassment to us, right? Princess in authoritarian states of the Middle East, right? Finding India wanting, not living up to its ideals. And we just realized that how much, international capital we were losing. That's the only pushback we got. I don't think we have acknowledged the moral, legal, and constitutional wrong of what we were trying to perpetuate in exploiting this pandemic for communal purposes.
Professor Mehta, then let me take the long view now. How do you see the corona pandemic changing or reshaping political agendas? For much too long, the discourse, particularly at election time, is dominated by vote banks, by caste, by community. Do you actually see a reset of political agendas at all? Do you believe that the nature of our politics will change as a result of such a tectonic event?
So, Rajdeep, obviously, it's, honestly, one should say it's too soon to tell. We still don't know so many dimensions of how long this pandemic is going to last, how deep the damage is. Um, but let me say this, which is, I think the indications right now, as we speak, are that instead of resetting this politics, it is actually going to exaggerate the destructive tendencies that we were already unleashing. Right? And just to give one small example to make it vivid, right? You would have thought that in the face of a crisis like this, right, we would reset our political priorities to, let's say, public health, for example, right? The single biggest crime need in India right now. Okay, we have a relief package. We have all kinds of things being proposed, right? Did you hear the word public health anywhere, right? Many economists have given a sensible proposal, 50, 60,000 crores on public health can actually prevent possibly a future lockdown, right? Do we see a scaling back of communalism? Do we see a scaling back of authoritarianism? So I'm afraid, and I think the kind of estrangement that we will have produced in large numbers of Indian citizens, migrant labor, is that at least in the short to medium term, you will probably see more conflict in Indian society rather than less. Right? As the optimistic narrative obviously recedes, right? I mean, these are going to be a tough couple of years. Even if you're not an economic determinist, it's common sense to think that as the economic story sours, most of our social conflicts are actually going to break open into the floor. Now, what comes out of that churn, we don't know. But I think right now, I mean, the disappointment to many of us has been that this moment of crisis has exaggerated the worst in us rather than taking us down the path of a better social democracy or social solidarity.
You know, those are profound thoughts that you're leaving us with, Professor Mehta. As you said, we can't crystal ball gaze into the future, but you've given us a sense of where we lie as a society and a state at the moment. For sharing your thoughts, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, I appreciate your joining us here on Info Corona. Thank you so much.